On Russian television, they could scarcely contain their glee. Against the backdrop of an American prisoner released from a Moscow jail this week, the anchorwoman asks, has Russia been promised Kyiv or Odessa? President Trump, she says, has an excellent friendship with President Putin. And what about the Ukrainian president visiting a proposed nuclear power plant? President Trump called him after speaking to President Putin last night.
It's important that everything does not go according to Putin's plan. He wants to make all his negotiations bilateral between him and the United States, but we, as a sovereign country, simply will not be able to accept any agreements taken without us.
But this was Trump on Ukraine a few days ago.
You know, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal, they may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday.
The new US Defense Secretary at NATO today may not aim to have Ukraine as Russian someday, but the very idea is an anathema to everyone else in the room.
There is no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace, a negotiated peace. As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to. That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace.
But the Europeans fear a Trump-Putin stitch-up, which freezes both them and the Ukrainians out of any peace talks. For the EU's top diplomat, who comes from Estonia, a former Soviet state that fears the same fate as Ukraine, it's existential.
It is clear that any deal behind our backs will not work. Any agreement will need also Ukraine and Europe being part of it. And this is clear that appeasement also always fails. So Ukraine will continue to resist and Europe will continue to back Ukraine.
Britain, which sometimes hovers between the US and Europe, is clearly in the European camp.
There can be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine, and Ukraine's voice must be at the heart of any talks.
Some might recall a meeting exactly 80 years ago, when the Soviet, British and American leaders, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt, met at Yalta in Crimea to carve up the world after World War II. War-ravaged occupied countries had no say. The great powers decided everything. Might was right. And that's how the new US administration sees it too.
We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power.
Ukrainian soldiers on the front line aren't thinking about history. For them, it's about personal survival and the survival of their country. Because if Ukraine is sacrificed to Russia, what was the point? Why did their comrades die? The atrocities Russian soldiers committed in Bucha, will they be not punished but rewarded for them? Ukrainian cities are still being bombarded. They desperately need peace, as President Trump says, but not at the cost of losing their independence or reaching a temporary peace, only for Russia to come back for more in a few years' time. The NATO family photo, but the family is divided. Europe, the Americans have made clear, has to increase military spending, and they can defend Ukraine if they like. America isn't going to. The post-World War II order is over. Get used to it.
Lindsay Hilson reporting there. Well, every day seems to deliver another geopolitical bombshell from the Trump White House. Let's get more from our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, no bombshell yet, Matt, but it was interesting last night. Donald Trump in the White House was asked on multiple occasions if his peace talks with Putin would include Ukraine. And I have to say, he was non-committal at best. At one point, a journalist pressed him on the matter. Do you view Ukraine, he was asked, as an equal partner in the peace process? The president looked stumped. It was as if he hadn't thought about that question. You know, that's an interesting question, he said after musing for a while. I think they have to make peace, President Trump said. That was not a good war to go into. No sense from President Trump that Ukraine had no choice, that it was attacked by Russia. He was also asked at one point whether or not Ukraine would have to cede territory to make peace. And he said that Zelensky is going to have to do what he's going to have to do. And then at one point he said, yeah, I think they're going to get some of the land back. I think they will. Well, I was up on the Hill earlier trying to gauge reaction from senators as to the developments. As you could imagine, the Democrats are furious, while the Republicans were torn between trying to be supportive of Ukraine and trying to be deferential to President Trump. Let's hear what some of them had to say. Is America betraying Ukraine?
President Trump, not America. Please make some distinction between the two. Secretary Hegseth has apparently said in a meeting that the door for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO is closed and that they will not be able to recover their sovereign territory. If you go back and read Donald Trump's Art of the Deal, you don't give up the most important negotiating points before you begin negotiations in earnest. For us to concede those as a country, for the Trump administration to concede those, would be a betrayal of the thousands of Ukrainians who have fought so bravely and died for their country's freedom.
But what about the concessions? Europe is saying, why give up things before you've even started the negotiation? That's a betrayal.
In my conversations with President Trump, he wants Russia to lose, he wants Ukraine to win, and he wants the war to end. So I know he's working hard to make that happen.
So the negotiations will definitely include Ukraine at their heart?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I believe that Ukraine can win, that it can push back to regain territory, but
the message yesterday was, you don't have the United States.
The message yesterday was weak and pathetic, kowtowing to Putin, bowing and scraping. President Trump seems to be an admirer of Vladimir Putin, which is a nice way to put it.
Is America still supporting Ukraine?
Senator Van Hollen, be glad to answer your questions.
Do you support Ukraine still?
I do.
Well, I certainly do. I'm very worried about what happened.
We both do.
Does America support Ukraine still?
I've said it was a mistake from the beginning to send $200 billion to Ukraine. I'm still opposed to sending more aid to Ukraine.
Well, one last thing. President Trump reiterated that he does plan to meet Putin in Saudi Arabia. He said that Putin would also come here to Washington, D.C., and that he would go there to Moscow. He was asked at one point whether or not he would meet Zelensky in Ukraine. Again, he looked puzzled and he said, well, I might. He wouldn't commit to that. Matt.
Siobhan, you're all over those corridors of power in Washington. Thanks very much indeed. Let's go to Chris in London.
Well, joining me now is Timothy Milovanov, Ukraine's former economy minister and president of the Kyiv School of Economics. Is it likely that Ukraine could say no to whatever Donald Trump agrees with Vladimir Putin?
Well, there are minimal conditions for peace on Ukraine's side. One of them is not ceding more territory unoccupied. The second one is some meaningful guarantees, security guarantees, because if those are not there, what is there to negotiate or agree to? Just accept Russian conditions. So something, for Ukraine to sacrifice, to make painful sacrifices, whatever they are. I think it is important that Ukraine gets something back, and Ukraine is an independent country.
So it could say no. I mean, the US Defense Secretary is saying effectively Europe has to be the security guarantor for Ukraine. Now, this just comes a couple of days after President Zelensky said, well, that's just impossible.
Well, yes, indeed. President Zelensky said, and I think that's true, that full security guarantees, real security guarantees, which prevent Russia from invading in a couple of years again, are impossible without the United States being there. Europe can provide, what, 50, 70, 80% of all, but that's, the US has to be there. Otherwise, the war will restart or likely to restart soon. So, yes, that's correct. And I think we have to bring the US in some form.
Do you think most Ukrainians will see this as a betrayal?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Most people see it as betrayal right now in Ukraine. The US cannot be relied on. And also, President Trump appears to be very weak because he conceded to Russian demands before even getting anything out of it. So it looks like Putin has played President Trump. At least that's how it is seen from Ukraine.
It's also remarkable to hear politicians both in Europe and in Britain comparing this to appeasement.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think it is appeasement. Peace through strengths. I haven't seen any strengths. No one has seen any strengths. People have seen weaknesses only in these negotiations, so to speak, negotiations, quote unquote. So we'll see what tomorrow brings. Maybe it's some kind of very complicated and brilliant strategy to appease Putin in terms of rhetoric, but then in practice provide Ukraine with real security guarantees. I think this will become very clear very soon.
But is there a realistic alternative to accepting whatever Trump negotiates, given how reliant Ukraine is on the United States to wage its war? I mean, could Ukraine go back to war without America?
Well, Ukraine is in war right now, and what the U.S. is offering is basically nothing, or Russia is offering. I'm actually not even convinced that Putin is willing to stop the war, or he's negotiating in any good faith. What is clear, I think, de facto to everyone, and President Zelensky has spoken about it, that getting territory back at this point is not realistic. It has to be done through some other measures in the future. Then NATO, frankly, even under the Biden administration, that has not been on the table. I think here, President Trump and Secretary Hegseth, they basically say what they say what the Biden administration has been saying behind the doors, but not publicly. The U.S. doesn't want to see Ukraine in NATO. So on that front, I think it is okay. It's just reality. The real question is, will there be military and financial support for Ukraine? Will there be American weapons? And will there be any kind of troops in some form, in whatever form, to prevent Russia from invading in the future?
Exactly. I mean, if Ukraine were to reject a Trump offer of a deal and Trump pulled American weapons, can the war go on from Ukraine's point of view?
Yeah, it will. More people will die. It will be still a war of attrition. I think Russia will make some gains, but those will be incremental. I don't think there is any chance Russia or Ukraine will make any major movements on the front because the nature of this war with this asymmetric technology, with actually very cheap drones, is that making large advancements are very, very difficult, close to impossible. So I think even at a very low support level from Europe, Ukraine will be able to resist, but Russia will be making advancements.
Mr. Milovanov, thank you very much indeed. Matt.
Well, joining me now is Nina Khrushcheva, a professor for international relations based in New York and the granddaughter of the former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. It's good to have you back on the program. Do you think Vladimir Putin, given this olive branch from the Trump White House, actually wants to end the war at the moment? Or do you think he's on a roll and wants to continue?
I think actually Putin he can end the war if conditions are fine, and it seems like now they're fine for him. He can end the war. He couldn't end this war if he's not a winner of it. He certainly could not be a loser. But now the winning can be presented because Trump called himself, apparently. We don't know exactly who requested the phone call, but it looks like it is it is Donald Trump. After the call, Donald Trump was all complimentary, talking about Putin and himself as we, and then referring to Zelensky and potentially not necessarily very respecting terms. So yes, I think he wouldn't mind if conditions are right for him. And for now, they do look right, although there is a very long road, as we all understand, from the conversation to the actual ending of this war.
And I mean, the Kremlin today actually, tried to reassure Zelensky that he would be involved in negotiations. And we heard similar sort of reassurances from the White House. Are those reassurances to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans to be believed, do you think?
Well, I think if Zelensky, I imagine, I don't know what exactly they're talking about, but for Putin and Trump, or for Trump and Putin, we don't know who is going to be the first in this scenario. If Zelensky behaves, that's fine. He can be there. But if Ukraine, and actually in your previous pieces on the subject, it does say the West is going to stand with Ukraine for as long as it does. But realistically, is if the United States withdraws, there is absolutely very little possibility that the war continues. Yes, it's going to be withstanding Russians' offensives, but Russians are going to take more territory. So they would not mind having Zelensky, but at the same time, we already heard Keith Kellogg saying that Ukraine needs elections. Is it a step to say that when we get to negotiations, it needs to be something else because Zelensky is too war president? He cannot be president of peace.
So do you think by calling for elections, they're kind of hoping that he would be voted out of office and someone more pliant might come in?
I would imagine, yes. I mean, I don't know what exactly they're thinking, but I would imagine that, if you insist on democracy, why are you not democratic? Why there is no elections? We even hear from Ukraine is that, Ukrainians themselves are now kind of concerned about Zelensky legitimacy, not in ideological way, the way Russians present it, but they themselves. I mean, because the war is not going too well. Zelensky promised that it will, and now it didn't. And, obviously the president will be guilty. So yes, but I'm not sure impliable, but somebody who is realistic, somebody you can have a conversation with, potentially Valery Zaluzhny, the Ukraine ambassador in London.
Right. I mean, the Europeans feel very kind of weakened by this. They feel as if they're the victims in this great power game. But they do have a card, don't they? They could fast forward Ukraine's EU membership, which is something that Vladimir Putin presumably would absolutely hate.
Well, the Russians said they wouldn't mind. I mean, I'm sure they minded, but they really wouldn't mind because it's better than NATO. Yes, they can fast forward the EU membership, but then again, how realistically the country at war can be admitted into the European Union. So there is some card. But I mean, I have to say the fact that Europeans are so beaten up about the fact that Trump said what he said and the story goes the way it goes, it's kind of shocking to me because clearly they're not thinking, or they're living in la la land. What did they think is going to happen? Trump is going to come in and say, oh, have all the weapons in the world. And they themselves really are not contributing as much as Trump would want or America would want. And then they say, oh, no, but we are with Ukraine. Fine, be with Ukraine then. I mean, that's what Trump is saying. Be with Ukraine. Do it on your own if you're all so brave.
Nina Khrushcheva, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.